please turn your camera off. It helps with the bandwidth issues if we only have the presenter's PowerPoint and camera on. So we'd appreciate that. Thank you. Okay, Rocio.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Rocio Martinez. I'm an attorney here in Fort Worth, and I practice immigration law. And I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about INA 287G. And if we could go to the next slide, I can give you guys a brief overview of how that program came to be. So in 1996, there was the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. We call it IRA because there's a lot of acronyms in immigration. And that changed the immigration law body, which used to be formerly called INS, to INA. So the Immigration and Nationality Act is the body of law that holds all of immigration law. And part of that is 287G. And if we can go to the next slide, the 287G program it's a way for state and local police officers to collaborate with the federal government in order to enforce immigration law in the simplest of terms. And it allows for DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, to enter into formal written agreements. They call them MOAs, Memoranda of Agreements, with local police, and they give these local police officers the right, the authority that a federal ICE agent has. And they do this in order to perform functions of a federal immigration agent, like immigration arrests and things like that, but they are not immigration officers. And so there's a lot of confusion about if someone comes knocking on your door, is it police? Is it ICE? Who are they? And this further kind of complicates things because it could be police, but they could be under color of federal law and be acting as an immigration officer. And these memoranda are negotiated between the Department of Homeland Security and local authorities. So the local authorities opt into these programs. It's totally voluntary. It's not something that DHS has implemented nationwide or is mandatory in any way. So these local agencies apply to the Department of Homeland Security to get included in these 28G programs, and they're vetted. And then once ICE says yes, they give authority to a limited number of police officers in that jurisdiction to act under color of federal law. And if we can go to the next slide, these officers can do a number of things. They can interview people to find out what their immigration status is. And this can happen in a number of stages throughout the criminal process. So it can happen when you're arrested. It can happen when you're being booked in. It can happen after you're booked in and sitting in jail. And the purpose of that is to find out who's here legally and who's here illegally. And another thing that these officers can do is they can check the Department of Homeland Security's databases for information on people, to check things like prior encounters. Have you ever had an encounter with immigration before? Have you ever tried to enter the country legally or illegally before? And all kinds of other information that Department of Homeland Security keeps in a person's A file, their alien file is what they call it. They can also issue immigration detainers. That's like the charging document that immigration issues for people, or they can place an ICE hold, what they call an ICE hold on people until immigration takes custody. So for example, someone's arrested and they're only allowed to be held a certain amount of hours per the Constitution, depending on what they're being charged with. And if they're not going to be charged, then under current criminal law, they have to be released. Well, in order to keep those people in custody until ICE can take hold of them, these officers can place an ICE hold on them and keep them until ICE comes to pick them up. And technically, it's not supposed to violate constitutional law that says that you're supposed to be released in either 48 hours or however many hours, depending on what you're charged with. But in reality, it ends up being much longer than that, especially because they don't count weekends as part of the 48-hour hold time. They're also allowed to enter data into ICE's database and case management systems, and that's really, really problematic for a number of reasons. One of them is that the officers who are entering this information are not trained immigration officers who know immigration law. And they also can make certain mistakes when entering information into the database that could have repercussions for each of the individuals much later in their case. For example, a lot of individuals from Mexico or Spanish-speaking countries have 2 last names. And sometimes the officers use the first last name as the person's middle name and their second last name as the actual last name. And that's really problematic because that follows them then into the immigration system. And then their birth certificates don't match up with that name, or their passports don't match up with that name. And it creates a lot of problems down the line. And it could even create problems with misrepresentation. The clients can be charged, or the detainees can be charged with misrepresentation of information to an immigration officer based on a mistake that a deputized officer made. They're also allowed to issue a notice to appear charging removability, and that starts the removal proceedings. And that's also really important and problematic because the date that you start removal proceedings can have a number of consequences on someone's case. For example, someone who's seeking asylum is supposed to submit their application within a certain amount of time. Someone who's seeking to defend themselves based on their children and the time that they've been in the country needs to show physical presence for the past 10 years from the date of their NTA being issued. And it's also problematic because some of the charges that are placed on these people are not correct. There's language barriers and there's all kinds of barriers, and sometimes the officers don't understand that a person who entered with a visa and stayed past their visa has different rights than a person who entered without a visa or without any legal status. And the charge that you charge them under gives them different options on how to fight their cases. And it's really important to charge them correctly, because if you don't charge them correctly, they could face barriers to adjusting their status or getting some kind of legal status in the future. And there's a lot of mistakes made because those are boilerplate forms. The notice to appear is a boilerplate form and they don't always amend it the way that they're supposed to. These officers can also make recommendations for voluntary departure, for an immigration bond, or for alternatives to detention. There are some issues with that as well, because these people who are arrested by deputized officers are often only facing charges and have not been convicted, but they're treated as if they have been convicted. And so their opportunities for voluntary departure or for an immigration bond can be greatly diminished by these officers and by their recommendations. And finally, they can transfer non-citizens into ICE custody. They can physically do the job that ICE does, which is to pick them up and take them to the detention centers. We can go to the next slide. And there are 4 types of 287G agreements. One is called the task force model, and that's been removed. The jail enforcement model, that's I think the most popular, and the warrant service officer, the WSO model, and then a hybrid model. And that's also been eliminated. If we can go to the next slide. So the task force model, when it was used, allowed officers just during their daily policing who encountered anyone who was a non-citizen, they could question them, they could arrest them, as long as they believed that they were here illegally or they violated federal immigration law in any way. That's been discontinued, obviously due to mounting concerns over the program's impact on local communities. It seems that the jurisdictions under this model had a lot of opportunity for abuse, and people were very concerned about that. So that model has since been discontinued. And then I think the next slide, we go to the jail enforcement model. And that one allows these officers to interrogate suspected non-citizens who've been arrested on state or local charges, and they can be placed in immigration detainers on those people. This one is the most popular for obvious reasons. It allows these officers to interrogate suspected non-citizens. So if someone is in jail, they usually have an officer, at least one officer who's been deputized at all hours of the day to interrogate everyone who's brought in who they suspect is not here legally. And it's interesting because if you're a native English speaker, if you speak English perfectly well, they don't even ask what your status is sometimes. And I've had clients be released with no jail hold just because they speak perfect English and they've been here most of their life. And if you struggle with English, or if you look like you're not from around here, oftentimes you will be sent to the deputized officer to answer questions about your status. And then the next model on the next slide is the WSO model, the Warrant Service Officer model. This one's the second most popular, where there's only two around anymore anyway. But in this model, ICE trains, certifies, and authorizes just a few state and local law enforcement officers to execute ICE administrative warrants. This is what you see in the news sometimes about ICE going, or officers going to pick up people with ICE warrants in their homes. And these officers are permitted to perform limited arrest functions. They are within law enforcement agencies as well, but they are not allowed to interrogate alleged non-citizens about their immigration status. So this is a lot narrower in scope than the jail enforcement model, but it still obviously has certain problems because people don't understand the difference between what the police officer's rights are and what law governs their jurisdiction and things of that nature. And then the next model on the next slide, the hybrid model, that one's not used anymore, again, due to mounting concerns over the program's impact on local communities. And that one really combined elements of all three previous models. So these jurisdictions would pick and choose what they wanted, send their application over to ICE, and they would negotiate on what their model would look like and enforce that model. But it's not used anymore, though it's still a model that exists. And the next slide. So there are, as of 2020, there are still active models in the US as of June of last year. So there's 76 jail enforcement models in 21 states, and there's 65 warrant models in 9 states. And like I said, these law enforcement agencies apply to ICE to get this kind of agreement. It is not forced upon them. And you can see the jurisdictions where these are located, a lot in the Southeast, definitely quite a few in Texas, a lot in California, Arizona, and actually Arizona has had a lot of issues in one particular county, Maricopa County, and we can talk about that later. We can go to the next slide. And so you may wonder who's funding this? How is this getting paid for? So annual appropriations cover the cost of training for these officers, and they also they also fund the program's management and oversight, which some people may argue there's not a lot of. But it really is up to state and local governments to pay most of these costs. For example, travel, housing, a per diem for the officers while they're doing their training. And we'll talk about what their training looks like later. Overtime, there tends to be a lot of overtime under some of these, in some of these jurisdictions, and administrative supplies. It can be really expensive for local governments. And it's kind of a win for the federal government because they don't have to pay for more officers to patrol, but it's a loss for the state and local government sometimes because they can really rack up some high debts. I think in Maricopa County, in Arizona, the sheriff there, I think, accumulated a $1.3 million deficit under their 28G program because of just overtime, just 1.3 million in overtime. And you can see from 2006 to 2018 how much things have changed every year, how much is appropriated per year for the 28G program. And we can go to the next slide. So in Tarrant County, they use the jail enforcement model, and you can see the language that Tarrant County uses. So, you know, it's seen as a positive thing in Tarrant County. It's officers trying to protect, serve communities, and enforce laws. It does explain what the law that governs this is, so 28G, and it's state officers acting as immigration officers, and they see it as a partnership, and it is a partnership. But I don't know if the question of whether this partnership should exist is really thoroughly discussed in the Tarrant County website, discussing 287G. And if we can go to the next slide. So you can see the language that is used to defend having a 287G program. It's saying that the goal is for criminals not to be released back into the community without being held fully accountable, and it's supposed to target very severe things like sexual assault of children, kidnapping, human trafficking, robbery, theft, DWIs. It's also supposed to reduce patterns of release and rearrest of the same person for similar offenses. Basically, what that's saying is it stops being our problem and it starts being another country's problem. Anyway, so there are proponents of the 287G program have valid points. And in theory, something like this would work well to catch people who have sexual assaults of a child, kidnapping, human trafficking, drug trafficking, those kinds of charges. But in reality, if we can go to the next slide, in reality, it ends up being that people with very small offenses, class Cs even sometimes, traffic offenses, can get into trouble, and the 287G program kind of gets them in removal proceedings when that's not the goal of the 287G program. So there are quite a few problems with this program. Probably the most is that there's not enough training or guidance or supervision given under this program. So there's a requirement that these officers have a minimum of 1 year experience as a law enforcement officer. And then there's a 4-week Immigration Authority delegation program at an ICE academy in South Carolina. In those 4 weeks, they are taught to, officers are taught to complete immigration forms, which as an attorney, I can't imagine that it would take only 4 weeks to learn how to do that. And they're taught to access immigration databases, and immigration is heavily reliant on acronyms and very specific terminology. And I can't imagine that a 4-week crash course will teach, an officer all of the acronyms that are in these databases, where I even have to look some of these things up, and I do this on a daily basis. And they get civil rights training, which I'm sure they get as part of their everyday training, not just 287G training. And then they also taught about outreach and complaint procedure. And then on top of this 4-week immigration course, they also have every 2 years, they have to take a 1-day training course, like a refresher course. So there's not a lot of training involved. ICE officers, on the other hand, have to go through a lot more training to be ICE officers. And as far as guidance and supervision go, there is an oversight that goes along with this, an oversight agency, but they're not, it's not systemic, it's not as effective as it should be. And the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, sorry, acronyms are crazy. The Government Accountability Office did a report on this, and they said that within the Department of Homeland Security, the 287G program has not established performance goals that cover all program activities. And they, let me see, I'm trying to find a quote in my notes. Yeah, ICE is not well positioned to determine the extent to which the program is achieving its intended results. So it hasn't established any performance goals that these jurisdictions can meet or show that they've met. And so it's really not able to determine how effective the program is. All they look at is the number of arrests, nothing else. If we can go to the next slide. And ICE is not monitoring the completion of training. So they're just taking these jurisdictions at their word. And then also the program managers who are overseeing this are stretched far too thin, and they're overseeing several jurisdictions that are spread out over thousands of miles. So it's really very, very difficult for them to do their job. Maybe it's not because they're not good at their job, it's just that they have way too much on their plates. If we can go to the next slide as well. Another problem with 287G program is that it hinders community policing. So if the purpose of the program is to address serious crimes, so narcotics smuggling, aggravated felonies, things of that nature, many jurisdictions don't target these serious crimes. They're over-inclusive. They'll include aggravated felonies and then very small misdemeanors, like a theft under $50 or a theft under $100, or a driving without a license, which is a Class C, can be a Class C misdemeanor, or something like a traffic offense. And that is not addressing serious crime the way that the program is supposed to address serious crime. And also local police stations depend on immigrants and helping them solve crimes. Sometimes it's through calling the police and alerting them about a crime that's going on, the fact that they've been a victim of a crime, or sometimes it's they're involved in something and they turn and they help these officers, and a lack of cooperation due to fear that they'll be removed really leaves critical information out of the hands of the police. There's also a lack of reporting of crime due to fear, which does not address serious crime. In fact, it propagates serious crime because no one's reporting it out of fear. It can also be abused as a tool for local police departments to pursue anti-immigrant agendas. Like I said, Maricopa County in Arizona had a lot of issues with this, where they were targeting largely Hispanic neighborhoods, and they were they were arresting Hispanic-looking or ethnic-looking people at a rate of 10 to 1 compared to white people. And it's just because there's such a lack of oversight, this program really lends itself for abuse in certain localities. And then there have been lots of issues with racial profiling and constitutional violations due to the 287G program. And ICE's website states that ICE will not tolerate racial profiling, that any jurisdiction that's found to be racial profiling will not be allowed to extend their 287G agreement, which you could argue is what happened to Maricopa County. But what happens to all those people who were already victims of the abuse in these localities? I mean, there's no avenue for them that's been provided. And if we can go to the next slide. And finally, there's other federal and local programs that you could argue overlap or are redundant with 287G, and you could even argue that maybe 287G is not as necessary. One is the Criminal Alien Program, CAP, and this program gives ICE access to jails and prisons where the ICE officers themselves, not a deputized officer, but the ICE officers themselves can screen and interview people in order to identify non-citizens for removal. And then there's secure communities. I'm sure you guys have heard a lot about this in the news over the last few years. So the fingerprints of all people arrested by state and local police are submitted to DHS and checked against immigration databases, and then ICE can take custody of those people with the help of local law enforcement agency. Again, they're not deputizing any officers. It's still ICE doing their job, but they are having help from state and local police in identifying people with a storied criminal history who are here illegally. And I think that's the last slide that I had, and I'm happy to take questions.
So if you have a question, you can either unmute yourself to ask, or you can type it in the chat and we can read it, whichever you prefer. I'm going to go ahead and start. I have a few questions for you, Rocio.
Sure.
How do we in Tarrant County, we have the jail enforcement model, and how do the jail staff know who to detain? I mean, you've already said that frequently what they're doing sounds a lot like profiling people who don't speak English well, but once how do they identify somebody to actually keep them there? Is there a database they check, or?
No, it really is just an officer who does the booking of the arrestee will ask a few questions, and if it seems to them that they need to speak to the deputized officer, they'll send them over to the deputized officer.
And then does that officer check a database?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, but like you said, the names could be wrong and frequently are.
Yes.
I'm a little concerned because when I went to the Tarrant County Commissioners Court meeting last summer, they were talking about how they only hold people for 48 hours, but you're saying that weekends, did I hear you say weekends don't count towards that?
Weekends do not count toward those 48 hours.
So it could be 96, it could be 4 days.
Yes.
That you're sitting there uncharged. Is there any record of people who are, one of the arguments that I heard in the public comments was, well, these are all criminals if they're already in the jail. And so I hope that you can talk about that maybe for a minute, and the presumption of innocence and so forth. And if anyone has been held who was not guilty, is there any data on that?
I don't think there's any data that I know of, but I've seen it firsthand where someone's arrested and then the charges are never filed, or someone's arrested and then the prosecutor drops the charges, or someone's arrested and then found not guilty, but they already have an ICE hold and ICE already knows they're here and they can't get out of that no matter what. And
is there a way to find out if any of those people who were held were actually citizens?
That happens very rarely, but it does happen, especially with children who maybe grew up with grandparents who were U.S. citizens, but not parents who were U.S. citizens. And they they weren't born here, but they acquire automatic citizenship. And it has happened where ICE detains them, but these, once they get sent over to ICE, not with the deputized officers, because they really don't understand immigration law. I mean, 4 weeks compared to 3 years of law school, it's not the same. But the ICE officers who do an intake, once they're sent over to ICE, do a screening. And if they hear that, or they hear certain things that make them think, oh, this person could be a U.S. citizen, they usually bond them out. They'll give them a bond so that their family can come pay and they can be released.
But they don't really pay. I mean, people don't pay a bail. They pay a bond, which they don't get back, right?
They will get it back as long as they show up to all their court appearances. If they miss their court appearance, they will not receive that money back, and the government keeps it.
So it's not the same as a bail bond?
And there's no bail bond. You have to pay it all.
Okay, I see.
We have a few questions on the chat from the students. Do you want to read that, Jennifer, or you wanted me to read to Rocio?
I can read them. It's fine.
Okay.
So Shannon wants to know, how can they legally get away with weekends not counting?
Good question. Also, federal holidays don't count. I don't think that it's the way that they do it is 48 hours are Monday through Friday, and they're allowed to make those calls themselves. I mean, there's no law that says that weekends count or don't count. There's no constitutional law that says that weekends count or don't count. You can make an argument with the sheriff and try to get your client released after 48 hours or your family member released after 48 hours. But then usually what happens is they just call ICE and ICE comes to pick them up immediately. So that's how they get away with it. The moment you start pushing back, they'll just say, okay, well, it's been 47 and I'm calling ICE to come pick them up.
Oh, wow. Melanie, oh, wait, let me scoot back up here. Jessica says, so it's just based on suspicion. If they think there's a reason to be held, what if they have proper documentation?
So if someone has a legal permanent residency, they can still be held by ICE if they commit certain crimes. A small misdemeanor like a DWI is not going to make someone lose their residency status. An aggravated felony like sexual assault of a minor absolutely could make someone lose their residence. So they'll put an ICE hold. These deputized officers will put an ICE hold on people who have very serious felonies who are residents, and they'll get sent to ICE and ICE will deal with them. U.S. citizens who have documentation that they're here will not have an ICE hold placed on them, of course. And people who are here with visas, with tourist visas or student visas, will be placed on an ICE hold because they're not allowed to have any criminal record here in the U.S. So just if they have documentation, it just depends on what that documentation is.
Okay. And then Melanie wants to know how she can access the recording. And Melanie, if you're in one of my classes, I'll make it available on the instructions for the paper, or I'll send it out in an announcement, or both. And then Melanie also said there's a threat that people are calling ICE on Mexican restaurants. Is that true?
I think I saw something on the news about someone calling ICE because a Mexican restaurant was requiring masks. ICE does have a tip line, and people are allowed to call the ICE tip line and submit tips on who they think is here illegally and what suspicions they have. ICE won't act on every single tip. They know that this can kind of become a witch hunt, but if they have someone who they have a warrant for and someone calls the tip line and lets them know, they will pursue that that tip if they have the manpower to. And most of the time they know, ICE knows that there are people working illegally in these restaurants and in these other places, and they're not really pursuing those places as much as they're pursuing big factories or big places that have a lot of people who are there working illegally. So I would not be worried about ICE raiding a Mexican restaurant unless there's someone there who has an active warrant and is a high priority for them. So someone with drug smuggling or organized crime affiliations, things of that nature.
Okay. Shannon says, I can kind of see federal holidays because bank hours, but cops work on the weekend. So, yeah.
Yeah, cops do, but ICE does not.
Oh, okay. Maria says, what should people know if they are detained so that they don't make any decisions that negatively affect them, especially if they didn't commit a severe crime? Say, what if they are try to pay a bond?
So the best advice I can give you on if you're ever detained is don't speak to the officers. That's the best advice I can give you. Just don't talk to them. Ask for an attorney and then shut your mouth and do not speak to them until your attorney is allowed to speak to you. Especially because you don't know why they're asking you things. You don't know what they want to know. You don't even know if they're after you. It could be a misidentification. You don't know. And they're going to be friendly and they're going to try to convince you to speak to them. Don't do it. Just don't speak to them about anything. Decisions that can negatively affect your case are admitting to something that you either did or didn't do that you can't take back later, and things like that. It just makes your case much more difficult. And they say that it's cooperating with them and they'll take it easy on you, but it's not up to them. It's up to prosecutors. So very politely ask to speak to your attorney. Your phone call should be to someone you trust who can reach out to an attorney, and then just shut your mouth.
Okay. John wants to know, what does the 287 in the agreement represent?
Oh, that's a good question. It's the section of the Immigration and Nationality Act that states the law. So if you go to the Immigration and Nationality Act, you look up 287G, that's the law that gives Department of Homeland Security the right to deputize officers. And it's not, and I forgot to say, it's not just police officers. It also gives the FBI authority. I think it gives the National Guard authority as well. Just not military officers, but FBI and National Guard have authority under 287G as well.
Okay, Maria says, can people still be arrested if they are with their children? What if someone is arrested and they have no one to leave their children with?
They can. Oftentimes what you see is that the police officer will say, call someone you trust to come pick up your children, and we'll wait there until the children are picked up, make sure the children are okay, and then take the person with them. And if you have no one to leave your children with, that's a toughie. I haven't encountered that. I think they'd probably have to contact CPS about that.
Mm.
And that's Child Protective Services.
Melanie says, doesn't that traumatize the kids?
Yes. Yes, it does. I have children who have seen their parents get arrested either by ICE or by the police, and it's not something they forget.
Okay, those are the questions we have so far. So while y'all are thinking of other questions for Rocio, I'm going to talk for just a minute. This is Professor Mack. 287G will be voted on by the Tarrant County Commissioners Court in June, and this happened last year too. These meetings are open for public comment. So if you would like to go, you can, and you can give a public comment. You're limited to 3 minutes, which is not that long, and they will cut you off. They'll tell you at the end of the 3 minutes that your time is up. So I have a link here if you want to see what it's like. I'll put a link in the chat to last year's meeting, so you can click that, and the public comment starts around the 2-hour mark. And I was actually there, and I'm at about 2 hours and 8 minutes. If you're interested, it's 3 minutes of me talking about 287G and its impact on women and children and law enforcement officers in the community. I did a lot of research for mine, but most people didn't. There were over 75 people in attendance last year who spoke, and numerous other people had submitted written comments. So if public speaking isn't your jam, you can always just go, you can write something up and hand it in, and they will have somebody read it. I did a lot of research for mine, but most people just spoke off the cuff about their personal feelings and experiences, and the members of the court are interested in all comments. So I'm going to go back to comment again this June, and I want to encourage those of you who can attend safely to do so. If you want to contact me for more information about how to do that, I'm going to put my email in the chat, and I can help you understand how to give a public comment, regardless of your stand on the issue, because I think it's important for people to make themselves heard. So you can feel free to email me, and then also if you want a link to the video recording of today's session, you can email me. That's my email there, jennifermcfadden@tccd.edu. And so, well, Shannon, I think they do listen to everyone. They're very attentive, and they're very respectful of people. They get all kinds of comments there. So I do think it makes a difference for people to show up and make a case. And it's also important, even if you can't go, to contact your commissioner. And Tarrant County is divided up into several different districts, and you can look on the Commissioner's Court website and find out which one is yours, and you can just send them an email or call them and say, here's my opinion about 287G. John wants to know, is the meeting virtual? No. They started off last year having some virtual meetings, and then they disallowed it, and there was some controversy over that because it was making people come out in the middle of a pandemic. So you had to feel pretty strongly about it to show up in a crowd. And there was actually an overflow room at Commissioner's Court because there were so many people there. So no, it's not virtual. And then Shannon says she's kind of jaded about politicians of late, and yes, I feel you on that one. Melanie says, why don't the cops have any sympathy when they arrest the parents in front of their kids? Rocio, maybe you know more about that.
I'll give the cops a little credit on this. I have noticed that, especially when it's a mom and children, they do tend to let things be handled without apprehending someone when it's a mother and their children. I'm not saying that for every officer, but it has happened to some clients where if they had been male and alone, they would have been arrested. But because they're female with their children, they are allowed to just be cited or asked to come to court at a different date. So I wouldn't say that every cop is unsympathetic, but I think that there the few times that it has happened where children have to watch their mothers or fathers be arrested is one time too many. But it also depends on the crime. You know, if the parent is driving drunk, double the blood alcohol limit, and they have a child in the car, I don't think that child should be in that car. I think it's just circumstantial.
So Rocio, you talked a little bit earlier about the impact that 287G has on community members. And can you talk a little bit more about the trust issue with law enforcement officers and how 287G affects that, not for people who are getting held on a detainer, people who have nothing to do with that in the community?
Yeah. It's definitely, especially with immigrant communities, it's definitely something you see already where people distrust police or are scared of police to begin with. So I see it all the time when clients come in who've been victims of domestic violence or who've been victims of assault or even sexual assault and things like, you know, serious things that really can affect your life or your child's life. And they're afraid to go to the police because they're afraid of ICE. They're afraid to be put in removal proceedings. That is a very real fear for immigrants in this country. And when they hear word of mouth that their cousin or their uncle or even their parents or something or someone in their family or friends have been arrested, it makes them less likely to report crime, which makes crime more likely to happen. And that's the effects of programs like 287G.
Yes, and there's actually a lot of research on that backs up what you're saying, that people are less likely to report crime in areas where 287G has been implemented. So back in the chat here, Shannon says, yeah, no, the cops will pull the parent out at gunpoint if they see a child in the car. Yes, that does happen. Maria says, is it known to the public how many deputized officers there are in Tarrant County?
I actually don't know that. I don't know if that's public information, but I know it's not every officer. It's only a select few. I just don't know the number.
When I was at the Commissioner's Court meeting, the sheriff actually did a presentation. He had a PowerPoint where he talked about a lot of data and statistics about the program. I was kind of skeptical of some of the budgetary information because there's some questions about the way they calculated how much it was costing, but there's some information there about that on the website. And if you click the link, for 287G, you can, I think you can access that, or you can at least see him talking about it. So there's more information there on the Commissioner's Court website from June 16th of last year. And I'm sure that that this year in June, he'll probably do another presentation like that. Shannon says, is there a limit to how many people they can deputize?
No, there is no limit. I think it's just budgetary at that point.
Yeah. Currently in Tarrant County, it is the Tarrant County jail staff.
That makes sense.
Yeah, so they're doing that jail enforcement model. Okay, do we have any other questions? Oh, there's one. Maria says, how can it affect a person's case if police brutality occurs during the arrest?
That's a really good question. So it can affect their case in a number of ways. One, they may have civil action against the police department for harm that the police department inflicted on them. Two, it may be a way to negotiate with the prosecutor to get charges either dropped or reduced or something of that nature. And for immigration purposes, if you're like assaulted, then you may qualify for a victim's visa, as long as the either police department or the district attorney's office certifies that you were a victim of a crime. And if they're the ones perpetuating the crime, it may be hard to get them to sign off on that, but you could find another police department to do it. I'm sorry, another district attorney's office to do it or something like that. So it could affect your case in a number of ways.
No more questions? I will going to put the evaluation. I'm gonna share, please scanning with your phones, and if not, copy the link. And please, we very encourage you to fill it out the evaluation. If it's you, we have another 10 minutes if you have any other questions.
I also put my email on the chat. If someone wants to email me directly with a question, if they don't want to ask it here and they want to email me directly, they can do that.
Okay.
This has been very interesting, Rocio. Thank you for giving us your time to do this. I want to say again that if anybody wants to go down and give public comment at the Commissioner's Court in June, you're certainly welcome to do that. If you can do it safely, I encourage you to do so. And if you have any questions about it or how to do it, you can send me an email, and I'll be happy to give you some resources on things like where to park and where to go once you get there, that kind of thing. Maria wants to know, can we still see the chat in the recording of this session? I do not know the answer to that. Do you know, Amalia?
No, but I'm here looking to see if I can do something. I think it is a way to download the questions on the chat.
Okay. Well, we've tried to be pretty careful about reading them word for word.
If you need to listen the recording, I'm going to be sending to the professor, Jennifer Maspaden. Rocio, if you want a copy of the recording, I can send in you a copy too.
Thank you. That's great.
And of course, thank you so much for all you do for our
Thank
college.
You so much. I've got to go to a telephonic hearing, but thank you so much for listening to me. And for
thank you again, Rocio.
Thank you.
This was fantastic.
Thank you
so much.
We'll chat soon.
All right, so in the chat, Belinda says, Ms. Lopez says, no, just the audio and video slides will be recorded, but not the chat. And Ms. Lopez notes, so.
Okay.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming.
Everybody can see the evaluation?
No, is it there? Did I miss it? I don't see it, Amalia.
You don't see it?
No.
Yeah, I'm looking too. I don't see it.
Okay.
I have problems today with this. Hold on a second. Let me try to put him back again.
Okay.
Okay.
So that will be the link for the evaluation and then also for attendance. So let's see if we can get that there. Amalia.
Can you see the link now?
No, I can't.
My arrow is like an... Can you see it?
Yes, I see it now, but they won't be able to click that link. So I can see the QR code, which they could use on their phone, but that link you'd have to paste into the chat. And Jessica says, Professor Mack, will you be adding on Blackboard an email? Yes, is the answer to that, probably. definitely on Blackboard, and I'll probably send out an email too.
The link is on the,
There it is, Somalia, that works. Okay, so if you can't use the QR code, the link is in the chat now, and you can go and do that. And if you're in my class, you can use whatever notes you took on this to write your paper. And if you have any questions about that, you can, of course, always email me or come see me during office hours virtually. And with that, everybody have a good afternoon, and stay in touch.
thank you so much to everybody for attending to this workshop. We really appreciate it. And we see you after the spring break. I hope everybody enjoy the next week. And we contact for another very interesting workshops is coming on the end of the month and as well as in April. The last Monday of the month, we have our meditation Monday, which we're really gonna need it after the spring break.
Yeah, that's with Dr. Irvin, and she's great. I love
Yes, she
she
is.
leads the meditation workshops.
Okay,
Highly recommend.
thank you so much. And I'm
All right.
gonna put my email for all these students in case they have any questions.
Okay, thank you,
And
everyone. Bye.
thank you.